quite often, the short shrift, and people don't really understand. I mean, I think that what Canada has benefited from in terms of the richness of the anti-apartheid struggle and the subsequent ending of apartheid came through working people's sacrifice. It wasn't that our government led this struggle. It was working people who made the decision. They were going to do the heroic thing, boycott, all of the things that led to get the world to recognize this was an evil regime and we had to do something, and we weren't going to, of course, be silent. And too often, this is one, but there are so many other struggles in which workers in this country played such a rich and important role in shaping, the debate that subsequently lead to the kind of changes that we did subsequently see happen. And I think what you're doing here, and thank Jane and Brenda and Ken and all the comrades for their contribution, is important for people to really appreciate again that working people can make a difference in this very important battles around the world, and especially in the context for those of us who are internationalists. We always recognize that our success lies with the success of workers in other parts of the world. It's not simply what we do here and how comfortable life we can build for ourselves, but how do we fight for others to ensure they can achieve the same thing.
Well, thank you. What an amazing overview and thesis statement and statement of principle. It's wonderful. I started that as soon as you started, after I asked for the consent form, and so I just started the recording. So I'll ask you once more to repeat that you understand that we are doing this for public, and you will send me a sign form.
Fully aware that this is for public, of course, distribution, and I will send you the consent form, so it will correspond with other interviews you've done.
Fortunately, my editing skills will allow me to cut this bit and put it back at the beginning where it belongs.
All right.
So that's great, and what a history you've had yourself. You are emblematic of a lot of that labor movement that you talk about. You came here as a very young person. Could you just give us a little bit of background of where you came from, how you got here, what you ended up doing, and then eventually how you got involved in anti-apartheid, anti-racist, and for that matter, SACTU Solidarity Committee?
I arrived in Canada when I was 16 years of age. A large part of that was my parents made the incredible decision for me to go to Canada. I had an older brother that was living here at the time, and they thought, maybe it's a way for me to have a future. And my brother said, Canada's a good place and I should come. Of course, what my counseling from my parents didn't tell me is that, you're 16 years, you're going to have no friends. You're not going to have your family. And two, you're going to go to a country where you're going to have to figure out a lot of stuff. And I hope your good sense and good judgment will guide you. And anyway, long and short, I arrived in Canada in the middle of, towards the end of winter. Was March. And didn't really know anybody here. The first 6 months, actually, I was of the view that why would my parents do something so horrible? And after kind of just struggling with a lot of things for 6 months, realized, well, no, this is home. I got to get used to it. And I need to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I was back and I registered. I went to Humber College for a while. And then finishing that, then I decided, well, if I need to get a job, I need to figure out, I need to have some real skills, and stayed in Humber College for another year or something and became a welder. And then as soon as I finished it, I realized I didn't really like welding, except I thought it could get me employment and I could make good money. And anyway, I did do welding for a short time. And of course, my decision that I didn't like this was true. I thought, okay, this is not very good. There's a lot of smoke and blah, 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 and this is not good for your health. So I left that workplace and ended up going to work at a trailer factory for a while. And I wasn't making much money. It was like $4 an hour at the time. And at first I wasn't too excited about the fact it wasn't paid a lot. But after I was there for a while, I decided one day to ask the supervisor for a raise. And I was quite aware of my own consciousness. And the supervisor, very decent guy, said, oh, okay, I'll go talk to management. There was no union in this workplace. And anyway, he came back several weeks later. He said, hey, Hassan, you're going to get a raise. And I was totally excited to hear what this good news was. He said, you're going to get 35 cents an hour increase in your pay. And I looked at him. I was just disgusted. And he was looking at me and he said, "What's the matter?" I said, "Don't even put it on my paycheck." I was so mad. And he said, "Why are you so upset?" He said, "Hang on, what did you have in mind?" I said, "I thought I was going to get $1 or something like that, not 35 cents an hour." So anyway, I told him, "So listen, go back in the front office and tell him not to put it on my paycheck." And he was just like looking at me, shaking his head. I bought a newspaper the next day and starting to look through the job advertisement section. And I saw exactly a job that was advertised for exactly the same thing I was doing, because I was reading it and I said, that's what I do right now, except it paid $7.35. And then in the small print, it said you had to join a union and it had benefits. Back then was, they'll pay your OHIP and whatever. So that same day, I tell the supervisor I was going to get on the bus and go to this workplace to make an application. So I said, listen, I have to leave at lunchtime. And he says, when are you going to be back? I said, well, I don't know. I'll tell you when I'm back. You'll find out if maybe it's tomorrow, maybe not. So I went there, made an application, and long and behold, the management says, okay, yeah, we're going to hire you. When can you start? I said, right now. He said, don't you have to give notice to your employer? I said, not really. I said, okay, what about next week? And the guy says, fine. And I started in that workplace. My salary went from $4 to $7.35 an hour. I know there was a union because people started to come up to me and said, hey, kid, you need to keep your nose clean until you finish your probation. And I didn't really know what that meant, except I shouldn't get myself in trouble. And a lot of older men, most the age of my parents, actually, my father would come up and kind of counsel me and tell me different things during my break and lunch hour. And they were fascinating. Most of these men actually was in the Second War. They had fought during the Second War. And I used to sit with them at lunchtime and listen to these stories they would tell about the war and the horror of it. And always would tell me as a kid, he said, Sam, whatever you do, never go to war. It's horrible. There's no glamour in war. It's just horror. And I was just fascinated by them. But I didn't know then, I didn't know nothing about union. My parents didn't belong to union. My father essentially was a member of the Communist Party in Guyana. I knew about that, but he never talked to me about politics. But the key was that there was a sense of working class consciousness in the family, but there was no debate about politics at the dinner table. It was after, a horrible period in Guyana in 1964. And my father just kind of didn't want to talk about that because he lost two brothers during that period. Who was killed, and he was bitter about it, but was bitter for the reason of how politics could consume families and destroy them at the same time. So I was very much not aware of unions and what union did, except I know there was a union. I was getting $7.35 only because there was a union. Anyway, shortly after I finished my probation, this guy came to me and said, hey, we're having a union meeting. Told me when it was 1 o'clock on a Sunday at Runnymede and Sinclair. And I didn't go to the meeting. I just said, yeah, thank you very much. And a month later, he came to me again and said, hey, Hassan, we're having a union meeting. I said, Sunday at 1 o'clock, the same place? He said, yes. I looked at him kind of strangely. He looked at me. He said, why wouldn't you come? I said, well, I shouldn't tell you this, but it's a bit embarrassing. I get paid Friday or Thursday, or what I think it was Friday back then. I get drunk on Friday night, I get drunk on Saturday, and I get sober on Sunday to come back to work. And I said, I'm in no condition to come to a meeting on Sunday. And he looked at me and he said, really? And he didn't say a word. He didn't judge me. He didn't criticize me. He was just totally above board. So the third time, a month later, he came again and said, Hassan, we're having a union meeting. I said, I know, 1 o'clock, union, run me in Sinclair. And he said, you should think about coming. I said, yeah, my habits haven't changed much. And he left. To my surprise, actually, that weekend, I decided to stay sober and I went to the union meeting. Sat in the back of the hall. And I think, what the hell could these people be talking about on a Sunday afternoon? And I was just fascinated. The debate about health and safety, about issues with the collective agreement and how we could be stronger if we had solidarity and stood up to management. I was just hooked. I was just like, oh my God, this is right up my alley. I could get into this and what have you. And that was my involvement. From that day, I never looked back. I got involved in the union to a large extent. I was very young. By then, I was turning 19. And my friend who would encourage me to come to the meeting, a guy named Bill Merlin, I know, still remember it today. And he came up to me one day and he said, "Hey, Hassan, I'm quitting. I have a better job than I'm going to, and I wanted to tell you about it." And I said, "Oh, that's too bad." He said, "But no, that's not the reason I'm here. I'm here to tell you that you should think of running for my job." And I said, "Why would I run for your job?" Well, he said, "Those guys you hang around with at lunchtime would support you." And I looked at him and I said, "Bill, I'm a bit of a hothead. The supervisor comes up, he says something I don't like, I just say, 'Fuck off.' That's the end of it." And he says, "Well, the older guys kind of like that because they figure, that's the kind of union rep they want. Somebody can stand up to the manager." I said, "But it's not very responsible." And they said, "Well, you think about it, you should run for my job." And I said, "Who the hell's going to vote for me?" He said, "Well, those same guys you hang around at lunchtime." I said, "Why would they vote for me?" Well, he said, "This is not very complimentary, but it is. They figure if everybody's going to get fired for telling the supervisor off, it might as well be you." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Well, take it for what it is, but it's your decision. Make up your mind. But if you run, you will get elected." I did run, and I did got elected, and I became the chairperson of the plant. I was never scared in my life because all of a sudden I was responsible for these men and had to deal with their problems at work. And most of them were immigrant, didn't speak English very well. They were very competent tradespeople, but they couldn't pass the exam to get their certification. And what I was struck with is that if you were certified, you got $3 an hour more than the person who was not certified. So I went to see the manager one day and says, "Why can't we find a way to get these guys certified after I became the chairperson?" And the manager said, "Well, because there's a law that said unless you're certified and you have this certificate, you're not a tradesman. So I have nothing to do with it. It's to do with the Ministry of Colleges and University. You go talk to them and figure it out. But I can't do anything about it." So one day I asked the local to send me, could I get some time off to go Ministry of Colleges and Universities? I went down there, talked to the guy. I remember his name today. This is like 40 years later. His name was Ted Jeffries. And I said, "Ted." I met him, told him the story, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you got a problem. We used to have a system to help those men, but we don't have it anymore. It's called grandfathering." And I says, "Well, why does the system doesn't exist?" He says, "Well, it's a bit of history of, we're trying to make the system more professional." And I said, "Well, what can I do to get these men certified?" He says, "Well, not too much right now." And I said, "You're not going to help me?" He said, "No, I'm not saying I won't help you. I'm saying I can't do anything to get them certified because that system doesn't exist." And I said, "Well, okay." I said, "I'll tell you what, Ted, I'm going to go back to my workplace and I'm going to gather those men and we're going to come down here and picket your friggin' office. Do you think that's going to help get them certified?" He said, "You're not going to do that, are you?" I said, "Yes." "Well, I don't have any other choice." And he said, "Well, let me think about it." So finally he called me. He said, "Listen, if you can get your management to set up back then it was a trailer, and we will send an inspector and, they will have to do things to this vehicle and ensuring that these guys could diagnose the problem and fix the problem, and they will give them a practical test." So to my surprise, within months, I went back, spoke to the management, and they had this whole thing set up, and one after the other over a couple of weeks, each one of these guys did their like a practical test, and they became certified. For me, it was truly an incredible moment because these were working men, and two, they deserved to be paid better, and more importantly, they were qualified as anybody else. I worked there for about 3 years. I became certified as a mechanic because I had to go through the same process and write my exam. The minute I became certified, I left that workplace and moved on to subsequently to work in General Motors as a mechanic. I started a new apprenticeship program. And that's where I went to, I think I went to shortly after I signed up for the paid education leave program. And I was able to attend the unions program in Port Elgin.
Oh, so you were already CAW by then?
Yeah, I was UAW when I became a member, and subsequently, by the time I arrived at General Motors, we were in the process of changing unions.
Okay.
We became a CAW. And when I went to Port Elgin, of course, it was a 4-week long program. And it was a truly amazing moment for me because there was about 100 and something other activists who were taking this 4-week program, and we were exposed to a lot of different conversation with people coming up and making presentation. And I remember, I think Ken, and it might have been him, and the two Kens came up to make a presentation to the paid education leave program about apartheid and about what's going on in South Africa, how the SACTU Solidarity Committee can get involved, and playing a role, and how people could build support for this in their local union, how they can get involved in SACTU, but also how their local union can get involved in this work. And I was just fascinating. I was very much a human rights activist in the movement, very much conscious around racism, because when I came to Canada, racism was still very much prevalent in Toronto. If you ride the subway, people would just call you names if you look like a brown-skinned person. They didn't care where you came from. You're one of them. And I was very much aware and got very involved in the anti-racism work in Toronto to a large extent. And I think after their presentation, I was very fascinating that, I should get involved in the SACTU Solidarity Committee. And I think immediately kind of figure out how I could become involved. And subsequently, of course, my local was supportive. They were making a monthly donation to the SACTU Solidarity Committee work, but equally, there was newsletters and stuff we were doing the local and what have you. And that was basically my orientation into SACTU's work. It was through the paid education leave program in Port Elgin.
Wow, that's amazing. And what a quick trajectory. 3 years at one plant, and then you're at GM Oshawa, which of course.
Actually, that was in Toronto. I apologize. There was a truck center I was working as a place in Toronto.
Oh, in Toronto. Okay. Still, an amazing trajectory for a young person. You're just early 20s by then.
Well, I think, again, like many of us, you find your niche, and, being in Canada at a young age without family and some kind of grounding, what the union, I think, afforded me was kind of like an extended family and some grounding, trying to figure out what my own politics was. I didn't really know what my politics was. I think I was trying to learn and grow. At the same time, somehow, of course, I was gravitating to a large extent my working class family background without not consciously being conscious that was happening to me at the same time. But I think what the union family did was provide an extension for that. At the same time, I was also learning many things that I didn't have as skills as to, I didn't have the privilege of coming out of a union family. I didn't have the privilege of growing up in Canada, and I'm trying to figure out, where do I fit into this society? Where do I fit into the union movement? And the union movement was rough and tough. I mean, again, there wasn't a lot of people of color in leadership position. And my background, to a large extent, and I don't know where I got this from, maybe I got it through my genes or my own determination. I didn't take a lot of shit from anybody. I was very much conscious of, if I didn't like something, I just kind of told people. And I mean, I think I haven't changed much in this regard, even though in this position here at the Congress, if I don't like something, I just tell people, and, they can do whatever they want. I think I got to this position as a president because I didn't accept the judgment of the movement when they said, they had a guy who was going to remain president. I said, well, that's good, but we'll have a fight over it and we'll figure it out, and ultimately the delegates will make that decision. So I was very much a bit of a rebel in that sense. I didn't accept anything. And I think when I got involved in SACTU, it was sort of like, okay, this fits into my own belief about sense of equality and social justice, but also it kind of fits into my orientation as an internationalist. I read lots about what was going around the world, but it's also at the same time what was going on in Central and South America, and the violence, the coups in Latin America. All of this was prevalent in that period. I was also very active in the Latin American work. It was El Salvador, which is a bloody conflict, Nicaragua, another bloody conflict, Guatemala, of course, coups in Argentina and Chile. All of this was in that period, which, you know, as a young person, I was sucking it up. I was reading lots of Marxist literature. And what happened, and then I got involved with a partner at the time who was very much in university studying sociology and a lot of reading. Kind of helped build my understanding. But the SACTU work became a central part of my activity in the sense that I figure I fit into this. And as I got into General Motors, my union rep, who I didn't know at the time, was a guy named Pat Clancy, who very much encouraged me a lot about what I was doing. He recognized me much earlier in the work I was doing at GM. He heard about me, and I gave him an extremely hard time. At one time, I think it was 1982, he came to ratify a collective agreement which the union had negotiated that was full of concession. We have given up some things that in the collective agreement, but it's a terrible time for the auto industry. And the leadership felt, you know, this was the best way forward, and Pat was trying to do his best to convince us we should ratify the collective agreement, even though there was concession. And I kept just pestering the committee that, can they tell me what happened to our paid personal days off that we were getting at the time? And Pat, you know, he sat there and he wouldn't get involved in the debate. Finally, I said, listen, if you can tell me what happened, I'll be glad to vote for this collective agreement. I just need you to tell me we gave concession to General Motors. Of course, the line from the national office was no, we didn't give any concession. Finally, Pat said, listen, you know exactly what happened. We gave up the PPH days. That's how we got a collective agreement, you know, as part of the sacrifice we're making to save the industry. And I said, I can accept that. You know, it's honest, but don't lie to us. We're not stupid as workers. Anyway, immediately after that, Pat and I became friends because I made his life miserable, and he thought, like, who the hell is this kid that, you know, just wouldn't shut up? And he used to come to me. We used to go out quite often, you know, have drinks. And when I told him I was, you know, again, I was in General Motors, and he was very much involved in the SACTU work. And at the time, as I think many others have said, the labor movement, the CLC, was not on side with the SACTU work. As a matter of fact, the CLC did everything to undermine the SACTU Solidarity Committee's work. And for me, I didn't care. I could care less about the CLC. I mean, I was more interested in what we were doing and the support we were providing for workers. But at the same time, recognizing until the system came to an end, we had a lot of work to do. And I think, you know, the people who really gave a lot of sacrifice was Ken, Brenda, Ken Lockhart, and a whole lot of others who were doing this full time with very little compensation for any of it, but they were doing it, you know, the commitment to saying we've got a role to play here. And, you know, I saw incredible consciousness of workers about how we in Canada could do our bit to support this work. And there was the debate that we would have at the OFL, the debate we would have in our own union back then, the CAW. And I have to give it to Bob. You know, Bob was truly an enlightened leader who recognized this was really important work. And he was, for the most part, gave us a lot of political space to support that work, but equally to encourage us to keep doing what we were doing. Was always there to kind of, you know, to be part of, I think to a large extent, to be part of the work that all of us was doing. I felt that was a small part of what we did back then, except that I didn't know it was going to shape to a large extent my own orientation. Because in '91, Bob, remember calling me up, or it wasn't him actually, his assistant called me up, and she said, Bob wants you to drive him to Oshawa. I was on staff as working in the organizing department. And that morning when I got the call, I was pissed about this whole idea that this guy think I'm his chauffeur. I'm going to drive him to Oshawa. And I was like so fucking mad. I was just mad, absolutely mad about this. And I was fuming about it. Like, who does he think he is that I'm going to drive him to Oshawa? So finally, you know, I call her back and I said, like, why do I have to drive him? Can he not find somebody else to do this shit? And she said, you stupid ass. He doesn't want you to drive him to Oshawa. He wants to talk to you, you idiot. I thought, oh, okay, I missed that. Anyway, as we were driving to Oshawa, he said they were embarking and they were staying down at the Westbury Hotel. And he said, Hassan, the CLC is sending a delegation to South Africa. And I very want you to be on that delegation to represent our organization. And I said, thank you, but no thanks. And he says, what do you mean, no thanks? I said, I can't go to South Africa. Country is still an apartheid regime. How could I justify that? And he says, well, we have to make a decision. There's a CLC delegation going, and you can come back and tell our union, not the CLC, what you think is the best path for our union, CAW. I very much want you to go on this delegation. And I said, I don't think so. Anyway, we went to the opening then as the local 222 new union hall, and he did his thing, make a speech and whatever. And then on the way back, he said, okay, what's your decision? I said, I told you I'm going to think about it. He said, yeah, well, all this time have you not thought about it? I said, yeah, but I haven't changed my move. He said, let me tell you straight up, I'm not asking you anymore. You're going to South Africa. Now get over it and stop thinking about it. You're going to South Africa. And I said, I don't think this is a good idea. He said, I don't care what you think anymore. You're going to South Africa because that's the decision we've made as a union. And, you'll have your say. But he said, you're not just going there in a CLC delegation. There's several things we want you to do. When you go there, you're going to have to meet with Moses Mayakiso, who was just released from jail. The IMF had a campaign to have the regime he was sentenced to be hanged, as a matter of fact, and the metal workers had a campaign to get his sentence commuted, and they did succeeded at. He was just released from jail. He said, you're going to have to meet with him and convince him he need to come to Canada to speak at our convention, which was going to happen in Halifax. And I said, okay. And he said, in addition to that, there is going to be a big meeting in Eastern Cape that you're going to have to leave the CLC delegation and get on a plane and go there to talk to these shop stewards. So that's part of your responsibility when you go on this trip. And I said, okay. And a number of other things he told me I had to do. And I said, how am I going to do all this stuff in apartheid country? I'm brown skin, and don't you think I'm going to get myself in trouble? He said, yeah, you might, but you'll figure it out. I don't care, but you got to go and do these things. So I told the CLC delegation when I got there, I have to leave them at certain points, and they were pissed at me, like, where are you going? I said, it's not your business. I got stuff to do, and when we get to this location, I'm going to leave for a couple of days and I'll come back. And I went off and did my thing. I met with Moses, convinced him he had to come to Canada. And, he said absolutely he was going to come and speak at our CAW convention. I went on to Eastern Cape, and each place that I went on behalf of the union, it opened my eyes about being in South Africa, first of all, what workers was going through, the passion, the determination, but also the consciousness. They knew who SACTU was. They were very aware of the work that was going on internationally in solidarity of their struggles, and more importantly, that we are going to persevere in regard to our effort, despite Mandela being released from prison, until apartheid came to an end. We need to stick with the effort to maintain sanctions and to support these workers. It was truly, for me, it was monumental, but also, again, one of the greatest opportunities in one's life to get to do these things on behalf of the union. But it reinforced again, despite what the CLC was saying, that SACTU didn't have any base in the country among workers and the trade union movement, that was completely the opposite of what, I of course, I learned as I was there, which I knew was a lie anyway. I did finish my trip in the CLC delegation with a very interesting, the last place we went to was in Cape Town. This was the last part of the delegation, and so the trip ended, and we were talking about the report and what have you, and it was unanimous that we were going to recommend that at least Canada and the labor movement here maintain the sanctions until apartheid came to an end. And so that morning, as we were ready to go, we had some free time, so we thought we were going to go to a market in Cape Town. So we got into a cab to go to this market, and the driver, who didn't know us, started asking a lot of questions. See, what are you guys doing here? I said, well, we're on a fact-finding mission, what have you. And he said, he said, I'm a colored person. And I'm looking at him from the back seat. He looks very black to me. And I said, you are? He said, yeah, I live in a different area. And he started talking, by saying, those black people and those communists and whatever. I'm sitting there scratching my head, and and this guy is going on. I said, well, I finally interrupted. I said, excuse me, I'm a big ANC supporter. And I don't want to be rude, but I said, from where I'm sitting, whatever you're telling me about your being a colored person, you look fucking pretty black from back here. And I would prefer not to listen to your conversation, and could you just get us to the location? So we did. I was there, actually. Ken Newman and the steelworkers, he was representing the steelworkers. We were in the camp together, and Ken said, oh my God, would you just shut up? We're going to get killed here today. So we got to this market, and what we discovered, the market was closed because it was raining. And then we had to come back. Of course, what I didn't know, that guy was the only cab driver working on that Sunday. So he called, and he came to pick us up. I didn't say a single word as we got back to the hotel. I said to Ken, we should go for a drink. And I said, my God, could you imagine that person believing he's different than his other comrades who are struggling to end apartheid? He thinks he's different because the regime, again, told him he's colored, he will have a different set of rights versus black people. And he actually believed it. And he actually are peddling the propaganda. And Ken says, yeah. Anyway, long and short, I came back and did recommend, I think it was in, we had a staff meeting in Port Elgin, and Bob asked me to talk about the trip. And I was very emotional about it, to be honest. Coming back from there, recognizing, of course, all of the years of the anti-apartheid work, we had moved this work a long way. We're that close now of, this battle.
What
now,
period are we at here? What
I think it was this around close to 91.
Okay.
Trying to remember whenever the CAW convention was in Halifax. And I thought, oh my God, this thing is so close. But I never believed, even though I went to South Africa, I didn't think that I would live long enough to see the regime come to an end. But anyway, our union position was strong. I was quite, Bob was clear that that's the position of the union. And he will, of course, do his best at the CLC level to convince them they need to support that. Little did I know, again, I was asked to go back to South Africa in 1994 for the first democratic election of the country. And it was truly a monumental moment. But, in reflecting on all of this, it was a perseverance and a shared determination of the SACTU Solidarity Committee to stay with this work. It also revealed, of course, all the contradictions you can find in the labor movement, that the CLC spent decades undermining the solidarity work that SACTU was doing, trying to deny it had any legitimacy. We were just a bunch of left-wing, activists trying to delegitimizing the role of the CLC in its role. And of course, history, of course, prove us right, but equally, of course, what I also learned is that COSATU, which of course is what became the above board organization to take up the cause of working people in South Africa, didn't see any contradictions with the SACTU work and COSATU's work. I mean, they did not. Jay Naidu, I met with him when I went to 91. He told me point blank, he said, there is no contradiction here. I'm not here to counsel you, to tell you what you guys are doing. What we're doing are separate. It's part of the same struggle. And it was an amazing conversation, having that with him in South Africa, but equally his determination and support. He said, obviously this is one of the same movement. They're not separate, but equally you guys need to continue your effort. And by the way, Jay and I become close friends. He married a Canadian. He became a minister in Mandela's government and maintained that friendship. Every time he comes to Canada, he calls me and we connect. And if he's in Ottawa, we have a drink, or if he's in Montreal or he's coming to Toronto. Up to today, I still stay in touch with him and became very close friends. When he wrote his book, he was in Canada. I said, well, come. The CLC was having an executive meeting. I invited him to come, and he spoke about his book, and again, got a chance to say hi to some friends, and equally remind us again of the work and the effort we put in to help them in their effort to end the apartheid regime in South Africa. But again, it revealed to a large extent how the international work can be so conflicted again. And, here I am as the president of CLC, represent all the contradiction the CLC was against in the work that we were doing at the time. And today having to go in 94, leading a CLC, part of a CLC delegation in 94, and at the end, subsequent to that, lead many other delegations to South Africa on behalf of the Congress as an officer for the Congress. So again, I think it's humbling to have been part of this work, the relationship you've built among friends, but equally, I think more than that, in addition to, what we learn in our efforts as activists, supporting our comrades in South Africa, it also helped us, I think, develop our own politics and grounding about the work we were doing for working people in other parts of the world. And of course, what we were doing to assist and support the efforts of South Africans who were in the forefront of this battle, I think reinforced to a large extent our own class struggle as how we can build a better world for working people here, but equally how we can build a better world for workers in South Africa.
Do you think that all our efforts, unions and others, had an impact on the Canadian government and its reluctance to take action on South Africa?
I think it gave them the courage and determination to fight when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan was not on side. I think Mulroney knew that we had arisen the consciousness among Canadians, not just on workers' consciousness, but Canadian consciousness, that it was morally the right thing for the Canadian government to do, to push those two right-wing neocons to say, hey, you got to get on board to support isolating this regime so we can bring an end to apartheid. But the Canadian government didn't arrive at that position through their own effort. They arrived at that position because Canadians as a whole and workers in the process of that raised the consciousness of Canadians to say, this is morally unacceptable. That Canadian government had a role to play, and that role is to be on side with Canadians, which was recognizing we had to end apartheid in South Africa.
And the local unions were a very big part of that. It seems like the education there led to even local actions that represented that education.
Well, the education come to a large extent with the Solidarity Committee. I think the presentation at local unions about why they needed to support that work, but equally, if they could find activists they could assign to be part of the Solidarity Committee, the SACTU Solidarity Committee. All of us had a role to play. Like we would go back to our local union and make motions to say we need to pass a motion to make a donation on a monthly basis to the SACTU Solidarity Committee to support that work, to make sure they had the resources to continue that work, but equally to send back to the folks who are in the struggle so they can have resources to carry on their fight in South Africa and in other parts of the world.
And some of the old comrades are no longer with us. You mentioned both Pat Clancy and Bob White, and they were key players in this work.
I think Bob is then president of the union, but also when he's a Canadian director, very much was on side from the get-go. And I think he felt naturally an affinity to the work that we were doing and accepted that and his role in supporting that work. I remember very consciously there was a huge debate at the OFL convention in Toronto when Bob had to once and for all tell the CLC enough is enough. John Harker and all of those individuals who were trying to isolate the work, telling us we had no a basis for continuing our efforts as a SACTU Solidarity Committee. He took a stand at the OFL convention and made it very clear, this is unacceptable. Yeah, despite the fact that SACTU and COSATU were emerging as an above ground movement, you do not have the right to tell workers who are doing the SACTU Solidarity Committee they don't have a role to play here anymore. And I think that was a really defining moment in our effort, but equally was critical at that point because this is where, of course, changes were starting to happen incrementally. Mandela was going to be released from prison. Countries around the world were figuring out how they can get on board to support isolating South Africa. And of course, what these guys were doing, still waging a war with us rather than waging a war against the regime in South Africa. And I think Bob's position at that OFL convention was very first of all, very conscious of him as to what he was saying on that convention floor, but equally giving support to the activists who have been doing that work to make sure they know they were not isolated, but more equally that the CLC was not going to play its stupid games anymore in trying to somehow tell us that we didn't have legitimacy in the work we were doing.
And Pat Clancy, a fascinating character, very grassroots, and yet it's too bad there's nobody around to tell those stories for them. I wish I had those chaps around to interview.
Something.
Jane, Brenda, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the workers of color leaders back at that time, especially in the 80s. And you were one of the very few local leaders who was a worker of color who were active in the SACTU work. I mean, in OPSU, we had Obi Hyman, who sadly has passed away too. And, you know, Obi was very active in getting the apartheid products out of the workplace at the Don jail and so on. And certainly there were many Black workers in the healthcare unions and hotels and restaurants and so on, but very few workers of color who were leaders and who were part of that anti-apartheid struggle. Can you talk a bit about that? I mean, I know it was different times, but maybe we'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, for me at the time, again, the SACTU work fits very much into my own, I think, commitment about fighting racism in Canada. And at the same time, we were having all these battles with, you know, in the labor movement about how do we fight racism, but equally, how do we take on the efforts around apartheid as part of our commitment in that regard. And the two things fit very nicely with my own beliefs, but equally my consciousness in that, and recognizing that this was no different in my day-to-day battles about equality in the labor movement. There was huge contradiction in the labor movement about, you know, there was really a sense among lots of white comrades, you know, the fight in South Africa is one we should support. But yet in my own union, when we became a Canadian union in 1985, I was livid. You know, I saw this as an opening for the union to take on the efforts around racism. And I said, here it is, we're doing all this great work on South Africa and apartheid, but yet on racism in our own union. And I remember it was at an OFL convention equally again, that we were having a raging debate because they had their anti-racism campaign and they had fired an individual, and some of us felt incensed. So we spent 6 months plotting how we were going to get back at the leadership in the OFL at that convention, and we had this resolution to really, you know, take them to task. And we stacked the convention floor and the microphones to make sure we were going to win our battle. And in the minute we won that debate and that resolution, I had this empty feeling in my stomach, and I said, "This is great. You know, here I am ranting and raving about the OFL and how horrible they are." And it was Cliff Bilkey at the time. And what about my own union? It was like I felt empty. And I remember tracking Bob Nickerson that evening, who came. He wasn't at the convention floor that day when this resolution was on the floor and it got passed. But he saw me in the hallways of the Sheraton Hotel. He said, "Hey, kid, I want to talk to you. Let's go for a beer in the bar." He said, "I heard he was rude to somebody today." I said, "I was rude to who?" Well, there was a guy who came to the microphone and tried to tell me he was going to take my spot because he was a vice president of the OFL, and I told him to go F off. Bob didn't think that was a good thing. And I said, "Well, if you had done that, I would have told you the same thing." So, and I said, "You know, Bob, I got a point that you need to hear." I said, "I was giving the OFL shit today about racism and what it can do and what it should do. But what about our own union? We're now a Canadian union. We don't have any excuse. The Americans don't have to give us permission. This is our own responsibility." And Bob, to his credit, the next day convened a meeting with some of us actually outside the OFL hallway in the convention. And we started to talk about what we could do. I think George Ehring was then our communications director, and he was responsible for this file. It was called the civil rights file. I said, "I don't know what you're talking about civil rights. I know about anti-racism." Anyway, that led to Nick DiCarlo, a number of us starting to talk about how we are going to push an agenda in then our new union CAW around the whole question of racism and human rights. And that work evolved subsequently over many years to where we end up starting to do some very incredible good work in our organization, that not only we're dealing with apartheid, but we're also dealing with racism within our own union. So, I mean, yeah, as a person of color, I mean, certainly I was very conscious about who I am, my experience, but equally at that time, it really was a lacking of leadership. And, you know, Clancy, I have to say, Pat was one of those amazing human beings. He was an incredible mentor for me, but equally somebody who allowed me to discover my own politics. Is what is your motivation? What drives you? You know, what gets you out of bed in the morning? Where is your consciousness about all these things? And, you know, he would always sit with me at, you know, sometimes and talk and give me encouragement and support. And I don't think, had it not been for Pat, first of all, I'd never would have gone working for the union. And had it not been for Pat, I don't think my involvement in the anti-apartheid work, because he was always there, kind of willing to listen. And when he became my rep, you know, he was always saying, you know, kid, you know, a marathon is a very long distance. It's not like a sprint. You got to remind yourself that, you know, you need to pace yourself. He said, you're in a big rush to get to someplace. And maybe you will, but you have to remind yourself that it's going to take some time. And Pat, you know, became my rep. He was there when I negotiated my first collective agreement in General Motors 1987. I was a strong advocate for me to come on staff, and he taught me a lot as a white brother. His leadership was incredible, but I think his resourcefulness to get the union engaged, the role he played with leadership, Bob and others at the time, to get them to recognize the work we were doing around the SACTU Solidarity Committee, the work that needed to be grounded in the local union, the work that needed to happen at the council meeting, the work that needed to transpire into the Federations of Labor and the CLC at the same time. And we took all of that on, by the way, against the greater, you know, grain of the labor movement, because we were always rubbing people the wrong way. But we saw it as a badge of honor that we had to take on these fights. That's how we changed the movement, and that's how we change the orientation among their own members. But the point that Brenda is making, there wasn't very many workers of color leadership in our movement, and I was fortunate. I learned lots, and I'm still learning today as a leader, the value of people with experience who were grounded in class struggle and recognize that, you know, we can't let ourselves get too far away from that orientation. Otherwise, we miss why we're here doing this work.
I just, a quick add in, Hassan really led the charge to establish a human rights director within the CAW, and he went on to become the staff, the director, but he also did enormous work following on from this in terms of building the confidence of Black workers and other workers of color throughout coast to coast in the union to take on the challenge of running for positions in the local union, whether it was shop steward or plant chairperson, and built a workers of color caucus within the union that really pushed forward all across the country on issues of racism in their local plants and in the union itself.
Well, I think, you know, that work that Jane talked about was it was hard work. It was difficult work, because creating space for people is never an easy thing. As you know, nobody gives up privilege without a fight. And if you want to change, you know, the consciousness of workers about their right to belong and to be in leadership, you've got to take the time to show them the pathway. And we were fortunate that the union gave us some space and then resources and what have you. But creating programs to help people, I remember when the union, after 91 convention, said you could, you know, you would have an opportunity to create some programs in Port Elgin to bring people from across the country to develop their skills and, you know, figure out how we could change the culture of the union. And I remember, so if you had a chance to develop a program, what kind of a program would you develop? And I thought, you know, I'm going to go back to my orientation, my grounding. You got to build a program that build their own class consciousness. as to how they can see themselves as leader, not just about their individual success, but how they can see themselves as workers of color representing the interests of other workers of color. And we used to teach them, to do costing as part of that 2-week program. And people say, why do you spend your time teaching people costing? Well, if you don't know costing, how could you go to the bargaining table to take on your boss in collective bargaining? And I teach them about, the fact that, that men are privileged and our biases are ingrained. And how do we change, is one, to be a person of color, to talk about your discrimination. But if you're a man that, paternalistic and sexist and homophobic, and people are saying, you're never going to get workers of color to accept that they have to change their behavior. And I used to go through with a lot of people, like they said, we agree with you on the racism stuff. Don't talk to me about sexual orientation. Don't talk to me about how I treat women. I said, well, hey, you're not going to graduate from this program unless you unlearn some of that shit you've learned over the years. And it was fascinating because it was 2 weeks. The union gave me a lot of freedom to run the program, but also to select the people to come to do that program. But over time, people slowly got to develop. But part of that also, too, was, again, coming back to the bigger question, how do you build equality in the labor movement? How do you change culture? And how do you give people an opportunity to aspire to things that sometimes they don't see themselves in? I didn't see myself as a leader until a guy named Bill Merlin asked me to go to a union meeting one day. I showed up and recognized, this is interesting, but the reality, had he not asked me and persistently, and even today when I speak to large audience and smaller audience, I said, I tell that story and I said, what is the moral of that story? Bill never judged me. He took me as to who I was, young kid who was getting paid on Friday and getting drunk. And he felt if I just get him to the meeting, he'll figure it out for himself. And I said, there's a moral in that story. Sometimes don't be so quick to judge people. You have to work with what you have. If you can convince them over time to see themselves into the struggle, they will get there. But I think, coming back to the anti-apartheid work, what it did for me, it gave me a ground in my own politics. I learned lots with the work around anti-apartheid and the SACTU Solidarity Committee. I think it made me a better person. It gave me a sense of the world and our role in that world, not to be so isolated in thinking of our self-interest. How do I improve my life? How do I get to do other things and to whatever, build a middle-class life? That was not the role of SACTU Solidarity Committees to say, hey, you Canadians have a role to play in trying to change the course of history, and you can support these workers, or you can be totally unconscious about it. But I think it helped me in my own politics and developing that relationship. And I think I said to you just Sunday, as a matter of fact, Styx called me to tell me that Peter Mashlanga had just passed away. And we were chatting on the phone, and he retired now, and he used to be the SACTU rep in Canada. And we were having a chat and told him that I was doing this interview. I said, oh my God, talk about coincidence. It'd be great for Doc to call you and set up an interview. And he was like, we were just reminiscing about all the stuff. And he said, oh my God, I remember Pat, and I remember Bob. And he were talking about all of that moment because he was here in the work we were doing. But he recognized, he said, very much so, we South Africans forgot about the people in many parts of the world who took this on as part of their responsibility to us. And he was reminiscing about Ken and Brendan. He said, I'm going to talk to my government again that the South African government should really recognize those two individuals. I said, I'll leave that up to you to figure out in terms of how your government deal with that. But he's very much aware, even today, as he's just, his last stint was the ambassador for the African nations in dealing with whatever. And he said, I'm finally retired. I'm out of the bureaucracy. I'm out of government, and I can do whatever I want. And I said, well, to some degree, but it's good that, we were able to chat and reminisce about this. But I think for me, and I say this in retrospective, but in sense of humility, my own consciousness and vision around the world about the work I do in international solidarity, I think was shaped and honed and learned by the SACTU Solidarity Committee. It gave me a grounding. And today I wear it proudly on my arm. I have no hesitation. If somebody asked me, were you a member of the SACTU Solidarity Committee, I say it with pride and say with honor as the president of Congress, because I think it really taught me a lot about the need for workers to struggle against the odds, and we can win. I was there to witness their first democratic election. I was there a couple of times later in a number of conferences I attended in South Africa, and recognizing fundamentally, the workers were in the forefront of that battle, but, we played a small but an important role in supporting them in that effort.
Hassan, I'm conscious as well of the hour you gave us, and that you're a man in demand. Any last word before we thank you for a really wonderful interview?
Well, let me thank you, Doug, and others for, trying to put this together. I think, as history have taught us, we don't do justice to the history of the work that we do in this country and the world as working people if we don't tell it, because it remains hidden. It can be anecdotal stories we all individually tell when we're reminiscing over a beer or a drink or conversation at a dinner table somewhere. I think Canadians as a whole need to know about the rich and encompassing role we played in the anti-apartheid fight, but equally the important role that a lot of working people, we're a small part of this in the SACTU Solidarity Committee. There were thousands of others across this country who gave hours on end and contribution to the fight and regarding to anti-apartheid. They need to be recognized, and all of this is because it's their heroic efforts and leadership that made it possible for the SACTU Solidarity Committee to continue doing its work, but equally for subsequently the victory that came because we were not going to concede until the apartheid regime was destroyed. And I think the enduring message in this is that working people can and have throughout history played an incredible role in making the world a better place. And we were one tiny part of all of that, but it was an important part. I'm fortunate that I was blessed to be part of that journey, and I thank my comrades for involving me in that process. And thank you for reaching out, because I think, again, we need to learn from each other.
Well, thanks so much. What a wonderful interview, and I appreciate your participation. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Brenda, for making this possible. And I think we can be happy that things have moved where they have. Thanks again.
And I'd be happy to share with you, if you wish, to Stick's number.
Sticks, yeah.
Yes, I would like that,
That'd
if
be
you
great,
mind.
yeah.
And I was also thinking, I don't know what kind of collector you are, but if you have any memorabilia from the period, please take a picture or whatever, and we can include that in the archives. The wonders of new technology allow us to build something beyond books with web pages and sound items and so on. So
I'll look at home. I have some stuff in the basement somewhere.
like most of us. Thanks
Yes.
again, Hassan.
Wonderful.
Have a good day.
Thanks, Hassan.
Good to see you, Brenda. Good to see you, Jane. All the
Yeah,
best.
yeah.
Thank you kindly. All the best.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye-bye.